Well, we really wanted to leave no stone unturned when it comes to the consultation. We not only just stayed in Ottawa and put up a website, but we went around the country. We spoke to communities all across this country, and I believe, if memory serves, there was in fact a roundtable that took place in Edmonton, and we invited stakeholders to come in. If people couldn't participate in the roundtable there, they were invited to participate in our online forums, and they were invited to participate in writing as well. And one of the reasons why, with this legislation, we're going forward with a standalone legislative committee is because that committee can decide its own workload, can decide its own hours, can bring in whatever witnesses that it chooses, and people will be allowed, I'm sure, to submit their views in writing, or if they have the capacity to come visit in person. Look, this legislation is, as I said, striving to get the right balance. There are those in the education sector who think that we should have further restricted our fair dealing component. There are those who think we should have expanded it. But we think this is the right balance, and those who have concerns, I think, will be more than free and more than willing to share their views. And if people have constructive criticism about how we can make this bill right, obviously we're prepared to listen to those views, but we're not going to listen to those who want to. We tried to get the appropriate balance. And the truth is, as I said, if you move one element of this bill over, if you expand fair dealing a little bit, you open up the digital lock protections and provisions of the legislation a little bit, you'll have a whole new constituency of people who are upset with it. We tried to take the full scope and scale of those who are requesting change in our copyright regime. As I said, educators, movie industry, film industry, everybody concerned, especially consumers. We try to take into the full scope of what it was that was in their best interest, and we think that we've struck the right balance here. The issue with digital locks, we think this is a central element. If you're a creator and you've created a product, if you've created a piece of software and you've decided to protect it in the way that you choose to protect it to engage in the marketplace, we think that you have the right to protect what it is that you've created in the way that you choose to protect it. And if people want to hack around that or break a digital lock without your consent, you have the right to protect your own intellectual property. I think that's pretty basic. And I think those who argue that digital locks should not be a part of this legislation, I just frankly disagree. I just think that they're wrong. There are elements of the bill in which we can agree or disagree, certain defining elements of education and how that should be dealt with in fair dealing. There are certain things in which we can agree or disagree. But I just think if you create some software and you decide to put a digital protection measure on that software and to engage in the marketplace with 90-day trials in which things are locked down afterwards and so on, if you choose to engage in that and you choose to protect your intellectual property, you should have the right to protect your property in the way that you choose. And it should be, I think, obviously in this part of this legislation, it should be illegal for you, for one, to hack somebody else's property and to steal it, to put it onto BitTorrent and spam it around the internet and degrade people's capacity to actually make a living on what they're doing. The start of your question was very profound. I don't want arts and culture, creativity, the software industry, the video game industry. I don't want the creative community in this country for it to become a hobby. I want business models to be able to work in this country, and that requires strong and robust copyright regime. Substantively, on what my honourable colleague has put forward as the Liberals' position, it's interesting. It seems to me he has a concern in one area that frankly ought not be a concern, and then he's opened the door in another area of policy, and I'm just wondering how he reconciles having concern for one area and not the other. He says that he's concerned that the legislation allows for mashups. For those watching, what that means is basically that you might take two songs and mix them together to use the instrumental, let's say the drum portion of a song and then the lyrical portion of a different song and put them together and experiment with songs. We don't see a problem with that, but he seems to think that there's a problem with that, or we think the idea of having a certain song underneath a wedding video is okay. We want to allow people to, to experiment a little bit if they so choose with the media that they've purchased. So obviously, so long as there isn't a digital lock that prevents that from happening. But on the other hand, he says that he's concerned with the technological protection measures, the digital lock provisions of the bill. Every single arts and cultural and creative community organization across this country, all of them support this portion of the bill. So the Liberal position is really that you're not in favor, that the Liberals are not in favor of the digital lock provisions of this legislation. Removing that portion of this bill would be devastating to Canada's cultural and investment communities, devastating to the software. The video game industry, which is 14,000 jobs, many of them in his own riding. I think there are 10 software and video game companies in his own riding. All of them support this measure, this protection in the bill. He's really saying that the technological protection measures in the bill he wants to strip away. Every single cultural organization in this country supports it. That is a huge mistake if that's what he's proposing. I just wanted to say to my NDP colleague, we're not suggesting, as I said in my comments, I think to the Liberal industry critic. We're not suggesting that artists and creators shouldn't be supported by a government regime to protect what it is that they've created and to find ways to monetize that. And that's not at all what we're saying. What we're saying is in the consultations that we did with regard to this legislation, there was no really effective proposal that came forward with regard to the private copying regime in this country. It frankly doesn't make sense. My colleague from the Bloc Québécois keeps talking about downloading and MP3s. She doesn't mention applications like Stitcher and streaming online services that people don't download music now and then you pay for the download. People are now streaming media online. There are whole new services now for streaming music, and so the proposal that she's talked about but hasn't actually written down so we can't see the details of it doesn't actually fit the current regime of how people are consuming music. It doesn't work. It's a solution for 1995. It's not a solution for 2010 and 2015. So what she's proposing is window dressing. It's not actually substantive in dealing with the issue of the private copying regime. It doesn't actually substantively do it. What we're trying to do in this legislation, we're not pretending that this legislation fixes all things at all times. What it does do is it mandates a 5-year ongoing permanent renewal of Canada's copyright regime, number one. But number two is we try to stop the bleeding. We can disagree. We can disagree about how the music industry may or may not be monetized, because none of us have owned software companies or video game production studios. We can't pretend that we know how other companies are going to decide to monetize. But what we can agree on, I hope we can all agree on, is that we need to stop the bleeding. We need to make pirating illegally in this country. We need to make theft illegal in this country. We need to make sure that those who are creating aren't having their efforts to make a living out of what it is that they love doing, which is music and software and video game publishing. And we need to make sure that they're not being ripped off. That's Article 1. So we can agree to disagree on the issue of the private copying levy and an iPod tax or however we want to talk about it. But let's agree with one thing. C-32 gets it right. We're going to make piracy illegal, protect those who are creating, and ensure that they have an opportunity to even try to move forward in this new economy. That's the first thing that we need to do, and I hope that she'll agree with that. First off, I'll start with agreeing with the point on which my honourable colleague began and ended his speech. Yes, of course, we are open to suggestions on how to improve this and make sure this goes forward. So I support the NDP. I appreciate the NDP's support to send this bill to a legislative committee. And the reason why we want to send it to a legislative committee, as I said, is that we can be open to receiving ideas that make sense. But I did want to push back and perhaps disagree with my honourable colleague, and of course he'll have the last word to disagree in turn with my disagreement. And that is just a couple of elements. First off, I agree with him. Obviously, the DMCA experience in the United States is something that we chose not to do as a government. We chose not to go in that direction. And there's one key element of the DMCA in the United States that he and I agree on that we don't think is a good Canadian policy, which is the idea of notice and take down, which is the American dynamic. And we propose in this legislation notice and notice. We think that's pro-consumer and errs on the right of individual citizens rather than a presumption of guilt. And we think that's the right thing to do. But I think that his private member's bill with regard to the private copying levy is badly written, and this is one of the reasons. It's one thing to criticize the government for what's in the bill, but criticizing us for not putting things in the bill. There's a reason why we don't address the private copying levy in this legislation, is because the proposals that came forward in our consultations were just unworkable. They didn't make sense in the modern era, and his own private member's bill is, frankly, with respect, badly written, and it wouldn't pass this House of Commons, even though I think you may have some allies on the other side of the House of Commons that agree with him in principle, because his own proposal is, frankly, unworkable. With regard to education and libraries, this bill, he criticized some elements of it, but and this is, by the way, a perfect example in this very debate about the balance that our government has tried to strike. The Liberal critic for industry said that our government is going too far in being pro-student and in support of students, and suggesting that we were not doing enough to allow people who write textbooks to be compensated. And my honourable colleague is saying that the things that we've put in place in this legislation with regard to education materials after a course is done go too far in the other direction. So we've tried to strike the right balance. Did we get it right in the end? Well, time will tell, but we think that we've done a real genuine effort here to try to get it right. And with regard to libraries, he said that librarians are upset about this legislation. It's just factually not true. The Canadian Association of Research Libraries said, quote, "We applaud the government. It has responded to the copyright reform concerns expressed by the library and education community. The government has clearly listened to what the library and education community has said." This is what we've tried to do in this bill, is to get it right. And if he has a reasonable proposal, he should bring it forward. We've tabled this legislation 5 months ago. We're waiting for substantive, specific amendments to this legislation that will actually improve it and to make sure that Canada stays on the cutting edge of intellectual property law.